Before Wall Street meant power, it meant uncertainty. A small strip of muddy land at the southern tip of Manhattan. Merchants argued, ships docked, and fortunes were fragile. But far inland, beyond mountains and forests, lay something far more valuable than gold: access. The American frontier was bursting with grain, timber, and raw promise. The problem wasn't production. It was distance. Transporting goods from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic cost more than the goods themselves. And somewhere in this impossible geography, a radical idea emerged. Cut a canal through New York State. Not a river improvement. Not a small project. A 363-mile artificial artery. People laughed. Politicians hesitated. Engineers doubted. But if it worked, it wouldn't just change trade routes. It would change power itself. And that is where our story begins. Not with bankers, but with mud, shovels, and a gamble that would quietly build Wall Street. In 1807, DeWitt Clinton began pushing what critics mocked as Clinton's ditch. A canal across forests, swamps, and rocky ridges? It sounded absurd. America had barely built decent roads. Yet Clinton saw what others missed. Geography was destiny. If New York connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, every barrel of flour from Ohio would flow through Manhattan. Every crate of timber would pass New York docks. Trade creates leverage. Leverage creates influence. And influence attracts capital. The canal was not just infrastructure, it was a funnel. A funnel aimed directly at New York Harbor. Construction began in 1817. No modern machinery. No federal funding. Just immigrants, farmers, and laborers carving through wilderness. They faced disease, financial panic, and ridicule. Yet mile by mile, the ditch deepened. And as it did, something subtle happened. Investors began watching. Merchants began calculating. If transport costs dropped, profit margins would expand. A canal is concrete, but what it really builds is expectation. By the early 1820s, skepticism hadn't disappeared, but something else had. Doubt was slowly being replaced by visible progress. Entire sections of the canal were now navigable. Barges began testing short routes. Farmers who once hauled grain over brutal dirt roads suddenly saw a new possibility. Transport that took weeks could now take days. And cost, nearly collapsing. Word spread faster than the water itself. Land prices along the canal corridor began to rise. Speculators quietly bought plots near future canal towns. Shopkeepers expanded inventory. Warehouse builders worked overtime. You could feel it in the air, momentum. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. That's how real economic shifts begin. Not with headlines, but with spreadsheets and whispered bets. The canal was still unfinished, but markets were already reacting to its future. And when markets move before reality fully arrives, something powerful is happening. Wall Street, though still small and scattered, was paying attention. Because whoever controls flow, controls profit. And the Erie Canal was about to control flow like nothing America had ever seen. October 1825. The canal was complete. Governor DeWitt Clinton boarded a boat in Buffalo carrying a symbolic barrel of Lake Erie water. The journey to New York City was not just ceremonial, it was historic theater. When the boat reached Manhattan, Clinton poured that water into the Atlantic Ocean. The wedding of the waters, they called it. But beneath the celebration was mathematics. Shipping costs between the Midwest and New York dropped by nearly 90%. 90. Imagine what that does to margins. Suddenly, Ohio wheat could compete in global markets. Timber, meat, and raw materials flowed east in unprecedented volume. And in return, manufactured goods flowed west. A two-way artery of expansion. New York Harbor exploded with activity. Ships lined the docks. Warehouses multiplied. Insurance firms expanded. Credit systems thickened. Capital began pooling where trade concentrated. This wasn't luck. It was logistics. And logistics became leverage. Quietly, almost invisibly, the center of American commerce tilted toward Manhattan. Not because of policy, not because of war, but because of water. Now comes the part most people miss. The canal did not just make farmers richer. It changed competition between cities. Before the Erie Canal, Philadelphia and Boston were serious rivals for commercial dominance. Geography favored them, or so it seemed. But once the canal opened, New York gained a direct inland highway to the heart of America. Grain that once drifted down the Mississippi toward New Orleans now flowed east instead. Trade routes rewired. And when trade routes change, power shifts. Merchants relocated offices. Shipping firms moved headquarters. Importers preferred New York's speed and volume. Insurance rates adjusted. Banks followed trade. This is the moment Wall Street begins to transform, from a street of merchants into a street of capital allocation. Money started flowing not just to fund trade, but to finance expansion itself. Canal bonds, infrastructure loans, warehouse construction. Risk was being priced. Futures were being imagined. The canal didn't just move goods, it created financial complexity. And complexity demands a center. That center was becoming New York. As trade intensified, something deeper began forming beneath the surface: trust networks. Merchants needed credit before ships arrived. Farmers needed advances before harvest. Risk had to be calculated months in advance. And so paper began to matter as much as cargo. Promissory notes, contracts, insurance policies. These documents moved faster than boats. Wall Street slowly became the place where these promises were priced. Not loudly, not officially, just practically. The canal accelerated velocity, and velocity demands coordination. Coordination demands finance. What started as grain shipments now required structured capital. The Erie Canal wasn't just an economic shortcut. It compressed time. And when time compresses, finance expands. Buffalo transformed almost overnight. Once a frontier outpost, it became the western anchor of a commercial bridge. Grain elevators rose along the waterfront. Storage capacity exploded. And every barrel moving east meant commission fees, insurance contracts, and shipping profits flowing toward New York. Small towns along the canal route flourished. Taverns filled. Warehouses multiplied. But the real expansion wasn't just physical, it was systemic. Markets were synchronizing. Prices in Ohio began reflecting demand in Manhattan. Information started shaping value. The canal stitched distant economies into one continuous pulse. Lower costs meant higher margins. Higher margins meant reinvestment. Merchants who once survived season to season began thinking long-term. Capital accumulation accelerated. And when capital accumulates, it seeks structure. Banks expanded lending. Private investors formed partnerships. Insurance houses diversified risk portfolios. Wall Street's identity began shifting from trade support to capital command. The canal had done something subtle. It centralized liquidity. Money, like water, flows to efficiency. And efficiency now pointed to New York. Even after railroads emerged, the advantage remained. Because the canal had already shaped behavior. Trade routes had habits now. Financial institutions had roots. Infrastructure creates momentum, and momentum compounds. By mid-century, New York was not simply a port. It was the financial interpreter of a continent. Grain futures, shipping insurance, infrastructure bonds, all found coordination here. The Erie Canal did not build skyscrapers. It built patterns. And patterns, once set, defined centuries. With trade flowing predictably, speculation followed. Investors no longer gambled blindly on distant harvests. They tracked shipments, seasons, and storage levels. Information began shaping markets in real time. Newspapers printed commodity prices with growing urgency. Merchants gathered not just to exchange goods, but to interpret signals. Wall Street slowly became less about physical cargo and more about anticipation. The canal had stabilized movement, and stability invites forecasting. Forecasting invites financial instruments. What was once a muddy dockside became a decision-making arena. The Erie Canal did not just connect water, it connected expectations. And expectations, when shared at scale, create markets deeper than any river. Insurance became the silent backbone of expansion. With more cargo moving, risk multiplied. Storms, fires, delays, each could destroy a fortune. New York insurers stepped in, calculating probabilities with growing sophistication. Premiums were adjusted, portfolios diversified. The canal had concentrated exposure, but it also concentrated expertise. Risk assessment evolved from instinct into system. Wall Street thrived in that system. Because finance grows strongest where uncertainty is organized rather than feared. The Erie Canal didn't eliminate danger, it made danger measurable. And measurable risk is the foundation of modern capital. Banks expanded quietly but decisively. Canal bonds financed construction. Later, they financed expansion elsewhere. Confidence in repayment strengthened New York's credit reputation. Foreign investors began watching. British capital, once cautious, recognized efficiency. International trust is not built on speeches, it's built on reliability. The canal delivered consistency. Shipments arrived. Payments cleared. Contracts were honored. That rhythm echoed across the Atlantic. Wall Street was no longer provincial. It was becoming credible. And credibility attracts scale. What began as regional infrastructure was now influencing global capital flows. The waterway had made New York predictable, and predictability is power. By the 1840s, the pattern was undeniable. Goods moved west to east. Capital accumulated east to west. New York had become the hinge between production and finance. The canal no longer looked radical. It looked inevitable. But inevitability is often hindsight. At the time, it was a risk, a gamble on geography, and that gamble had paid off in compound interest. Wall Street's growing authority was not theatrical. It was infrastructural, built on flow, reinforced by repetition. The Erie Canal had shifted gravity, and once gravity shifts, everything orbits differently. As capital deepened in New York, entrepreneurs elsewhere adjusted their ambitions accordingly. If you wanted funding for a railroad in Ohio or a factory in Pennsylvania, you increasingly looked toward Manhattan. The canal had concentrated liquidity, and liquidity attracts initiative. This created a subtle hierarchy. Production might happen inland, but approval, financial approval, flowed through Wall Street. The Erie Canal had unintentionally centralized decision-making. Not by law, not by decree, but by efficiency. And efficiency rarely announces itself. It simply becomes the default. Over time, the question was no longer whether New York would finance expansion, but how much of it would control. The canal also shaped migration. Workers followed opportunity. Families moved toward canal towns, then toward New York itself. Labor markets thickened. Skills diversified. A denser population meant more consumption, more services, more local enterprise. Financial growth was no longer abstract. It was visible in crowded docks and expanding neighborhoods. Manhattan's transformation accelerated. What began as trade dominance started becoming urban dominance. Infrastructure had sparked demographic momentum, and demographic momentum reinforces economic power. The Erie Canal did not just redirect goods. It redirected people, and people carry economies with them. Competition never vanished. Other states built canals. Railroads expanded aggressively. Yet New York retained its advantage. Why? Because first-mover infrastructure builds habit. Merchants trusted established routes. Investors trusted established institutions. The Erie Canal had embedded confidence into the system. Rivals could replicate the technology, but not the accumulated relationships. And finance runs on relationships as much as numbers. Wall Street's authority was now layered: trade, insurance, banking, speculation. The canal had been the foundation stone. Everything else rose on top of it. By mid-century, observers abroad noticed something unusual. New York was behaving like a financial capital before officially becoming one. Credit flowed efficiently. Information traveled quickly. Risk was priced competitively. The Erie Canal had accelerated integration within the United States, but its secondary effect was international signaling. Stability attracts outsiders. Foreign banks extended partnerships. Investment houses widened networks. The canal's influence rippled outward, beyond geography. It had turned a regional port into a global node. As capital thickened, specialization followed. Brokerage houses began distinguishing themselves. Some focused on commodities, others on shipping, others on government bonds. Division of expertise sharpened efficiency. The canal had increased transaction volume, and volume demand structure. Informal agreements slowly evolved into standardized practices. Contracts became clearer. Disputes found arbitration channels. Wall Street was maturing, not through grand declarations, but through repetition and refinement. The Erie Canal had provided scale. Scale demanded organization. And organization is what transforms opportunity into permanence. Crises tested the system. Financial panics rippled through markets in the 1830s and 1850s. Yet New York absorbed shocks better than many rivals. Diversified trade helped. Concentrated liquidity helped more. The canal had broadened the economic base feeding Wall Street. Grain, timber, textiles, multiple streams reduced dependency on a single sector. Resilience grew from diversity. Investors noticed. Stability during turbulence builds reputation faster than growth during calm. The Erie Canal had unintentionally engineered that resilience by widening the commercial pipeline. By the time railroads dominated headlines, the foundation had already been laid. Rail expanded speed, but the canal had established hierarchy. Financial contracts were written in New York. Commodity prices were benchmarked there. Information networks radiated outward from Manhattan. Infrastructure had evolved, yet gravity remained. The Erie Canal's legacy wasn't water, it was centrality. And centrality, once achieved, reinforces itself. Wall Street no longer depended solely on physical shipments. It had become the interpreter of national movement. Look closely and you'll see the quiet truth. Wall Street's rise was not explosive, it was cumulative. Each shipment lowered costs. Each lowered cost expanded margins. Each expanded margin accumulated capital. The canal set off a chain reaction of efficiency. And efficiency compounds. There were no fireworks, no declarations of supremacy, just steady advantage layered year after year. The Erie Canal did not demand attention. It earned influence. So when we picture Wall Street today, glass towers, digital screens, global markets, we rarely imagine mule-drawn barges cutting through upstate mud. Yet that is where the leverage began. Infrastructure precedes finance. Flow precedes pricing. Without the canal, New York might have remained a busy port among equals. With it, the city gained structural advantage. And structural advantage, once embedded, outlives generations. There is another layer to this story, psychology. Success breeds confidence, and confidence attracts more participation. As New York proved reliable, more merchants routed shipments through its harbor. More investors opened accounts. More institutions headquartered there. The Erie Canal had created a feedback loop. Efficiency led to profit. Profit led to trust. Trust led to scale. And scale reinforced efficiency again. This is how financial centers are born, not from proclamation, but from repetition. Wall Street did not wake up powerful one morning. It accumulated belief. And belief, when shared by enough participants, becomes reality. Political leaders eventually understood what geography had already decided. Federal projects, trade agreements, and regulatory discussions increasingly orbited around New York's influence. The canal had altered internal trade so profoundly that policy began adjusting to economic gravity. Power follows concentration, and concentration had found its home in Manhattan. This wasn't domination by decree, it was domination by design, though unintended. The Erie Canal had made New York indispensable. And in economics, indispensability is leverage in its purest form. Over decades, the canal expanded and modernized. Locks were widened. Capacity increased. Even as rail overtook water in speed, the symbolic foundation remained intact. The Erie Canal represented proof that bold infrastructure can redirect destiny. Investors remembered that lesson. When later megaprojects emerged, bridges, rail lines, ports, the precedent was already written. Build flow, control flow, prosper from flow. Wall Street internalized that logic. Finance would forever seek the channels through which value moves. By the late 19th century, skyscrapers began rising. Steel replaced wood. Telegraph wires replaced messengers. Yet beneath every technological leap lay the same foundation. Centralized capital formed in an earlier era. The canal era had trained New York in coordination, risk management, and scale. Those habits translated seamlessly into modern finance. Wall Street's skyline changed. Its logic did not. The Erie Canal had etched that logic into the city's economic DNA. And here is the quiet conclusion. Wall Street was not born in marble halls. It was born in mud, in calculations about transport costs, in decisions about routes, in risks measured against distance. The Erie Canal transformed geography into advantage, and advantage into dominance. Finance often appears abstract, but it begins with something tangible. In this case, it began with water carving a path through wilderness. So the next time you hear the phrase, Wall Street power, remember this. Power rarely appears fully formed. It accumulates through infrastructure, trust, repetition, and flow. The Erie Canal stitched together a young nation's economy and quietly anchored it to New York. No dramatic conquest. No battlefield victory. Just water moving efficiently. And efficiency, sustained long enough, becomes authority. The Erie Canal is often remembered as an engineering triumph. And it was. But its deeper legacy is financial. It shifted trade routes, centralized liquidity, strengthened trust networks, and redefined economic gravity. Wall Street did not simply grow, it was positioned. Positioned by water, by geography, by bold risk. In the end, the canal did what few projects ever do. It changed not just movement, but meaning. It turned New York from a port into a pivot. And from that pivot, a financial empire quietly rose.